Greetings, friends. Welcome to week 33 of the Bible in 365. Before we jump into this week's readings, I do want to take a moment and take a look back at something that we read last week. So last week we spent a couple of days reading the letters of 1st and 2nd Timothy, and there were a few passages in 1st Timothy that prompted a few of you to reach out to me with some questions. And so I thought, hey, let's spend a moment thinking about it. So First Timothy chapter 2, verses 8 to 15 are some of the most hotly debated verses in the whole New Testament. And those are the verses where Paul is addressing an issue that's taking place in the Ephesian church, and he talks about the role of men and the role of women. Now, I'm not going to be able to answer all the questions about these verses, but I do want to try to give us some context today. So Timothy is providing pastoral leadership to the church in Ephesus, and he's facing a host of problems. And in First Timothy, Paul is trying to give him some counsel and advice for how to handle some of the problems he's facing. Well, one of those problems is it appears that there were men in the church who were disrupting public worship because they were angry about something. And when it came time for the church to have its public prayers, these men were allowing their anger to boil over into the church prayer time. And so in 1 Timothy 2:8, Timothy's like, hey, I want all men to pray without anger. Additionally, it appears that in the Ephesian church, there were some women who had become very focused on what clothes they were going to wear to church. And they almost were trying to outdo each other and who could wear the fanciest clothes to church. And so Paul calls on them to dress modestly. And his reason for modest dress is so that they can focus on godliness. The purpose of worship is to focus on God and on promoting godliness in our lives. And so we're going to dress modestly and simply as a result. Then Paul shifts to the topic of leadership in 1 Timothy 2, verse 11. It appears that some women in the church had been trying to gain positions of leadership in ways that were becoming distracting. So later in the letter in 1 Timothy 5:13, Paul addresses some women who had become idlers. They were going from house to house spreading gossip. Now, Paul instructs the women in 1 Timothy 2 to learn in quietness and submission. And I think this is where we begin to really struggle with this passage. So Paul says he wants women to learn in quietness and submission. Into our patriarchal ears, modern ears, that just doesn't sound right. But we do need to take note of something. Paul is asking these women to learn. And in many segments of Judaism in the first century, women were not allowed to participate in religious instruction at all. So Paul is making space for women's education, even as he's enforcing some of the cultural gender roles of the time period. Now, when we consider the role of women in the church today, this verse about women learning in quietness and submission shouldn't be the only verse that we look at. There's a host of other verses in the New Testament, including in the Gospels and in some of Paul's writings, where women are given places of authority as preachers and leaders. So when you're trying to address a particular topic and say, what does the Bible say about it? You can't ever just focus on one verse only. You have to look at the total witness of Scripture. That leads to a second question that gets raised around 1 Timothy, and that is what's happening in 1 Timothy 5, verses 11 to 14, where Paul is addressing young widows. Well, let's put this one in context. The primary issue that Paul's addressing in those verses is the financial support and care of widows. So from the very beginning, Christian churches organized a way to care for widows. We saw that all the way back in Acts chapter 6. In the ancient world, widows often didn't have any legitimate way to make a living. And so the church would support widows. And what Paul's addressing in 1 Timothy 5 is which widows should be enrolled to receive benefits and which should not. And when Paul speaks of younger widows, he's not speaking of younger widows in general, but of a specific group of widows in the Ephesian church. They are younger widows, not in the sense of their age, but younger in the sense of their spiritual maturity. And apparently, these widows have given themselves over to self-indulgent, self-centered lifestyles. They're not seeking after godliness. And many of them were remarrying others. And Paul tells them, remarrying isn't the problem. He actually encourages them to go ahead and get remarried. But what he sees in them is they're letting sinful desires lead them. And so they're idlers. They're going from house to house. They're spreading gossip. And so Paul says these widows shouldn't be added to the registry of those receiving benefits from the church. And his primary point is that the church's generosity toward widows should be reserved for those who genuinely need it and whose Christian maturity is evidenced by their godly living. Now, there's a whole lot of ink that's been spilled over these verses I've been talking about, but I wanted to take a moment to just try to give you a little bit of context around them. Certainly doesn't solve every question there is, but those were some challenging verses in 1 Timothy. All right, let's look ahead to this week. So at the end of last week, we started reading the book of Job, and the opening chapters are heart-wrenching. We meet Job, who is described as this righteous and God-fearing man, and we see Satan going to God and asking permission to sift Job like wheat and to test Job's faith. And God allows it, and Satan takes everything from Job, and we see the immense physical, social, emotional, spiritual suffering that Job undergoes, and it is undeserved suffering. Well, this week we're going to be reading the rest of the story of Job, and the question that kind of lingers behind all of it is, how do we explain the suffering of righteous people? There are many passages in Scripture that assert that those who are righteous will prosper, that God will bless those who are righteous. And yet here we have the story of Job that provides a real life challenge to that notion. He is blameless and upright in God's eyes, and yet he endures immense suffering. Well, in chapters 3 to 27 from Job, we're going to see a cycle of discourses in which Job is approached by a variety of his friends. And his friends are trying to help Job make sense of what he's experiencing. And their only conclusion is that perhaps Job isn't as righteous as they all thought. And they repeatedly probe Job's life. They look for some kind of hidden sin that has caused such calamity to befall him. It's actually really painful to read these words, and it'll remind us of times when maybe you've been going through something really difficult, and a friend who was trying to comfort you actually said the thing that wasn't comforting at all. And we see that happen with Job's friends. Well, it's noteworthy that in the first 37 chapters of Job, God doesn't speak. There are lots of words from Job's friends. There's lots of words from Job himself trying to make sense of Job's suffering. It's not until chapter 38, verse 1, that God speaks for the first time. And it's there that we hear that God speaks out of the whirlwind, and the whirlwind becomes symbolic of the chaos that Job's suffering has created. And when God speaks out of the chaos, God gives a series of speeches. In the first speech, God humbles Job, reminds Job that God is God and he is not, and that God can see a bigger picture that Job cannot see. In a second speech, God reminds Job that yes, the world does have chaos and evil in it, but that God is able to control and God is able to overcome the chaos and evil. And so in the end, the book of Job testifies that God is a righteous God. And Job is a righteous man. And we do live in a world where the righteous suffer. Suffering is not doled out fairly. Some people who don't deserve it suffer more than those who maybe are more deserving of it. This is not an attack on God's character, nor is it an attack on the character of a human individual. Instead, in the midst of suffering, we can take hope in knowing that God speaks in the whirlwind. God is present with us in the hardship. God is sovereign over it all. And in the end, God triumphs over pain and evil. All right, I hope that gets you ready to dive into this week's readings, and I'll see you right back here next week for more of the Bible in 365.